You know by now that we're all about the journey. June's journey, that is. I feel this game was made for us specifically. It's the closest I've come to feeling like I've been dropped in the middle of a mystery novel set in the 1920s.
That's because you get to play as June, a globe-trotting flapper/amateur sleuth who lives to solve mysteries. You get to visit all sorts of fascinating places, from Paris to Cuba. You beat levels by identifying hidden objects in the scene. And we found that the more we play, the sharper our observational skills become.
The game is delightful, and a wonderful way to relax. I'll often pull my phone out and play it when I've got a free moment, like I'm on hold with an archive, or I'm waiting for a courthouse to open up in the morning. I'm currently on Chapter 16, meaning I'm searching for the son of June's housekeeper, who's on the run from New Orleans gamblers and the police. It's a wild time.
We know our audience is filled with folks who love a good mystery. Now is your chance to try your hand at being a sleuth yourself. Discover your inner detective when you download June's Journey for free today on iOS and Android.
Content warning: this episode contains discussion of violence and murder. Today we're going to be talking about another one of Andy Baldwin's ongoing criminal cases. Of course, Andy is one of the defense attorneys in the Delphi murders. He's a very prolific criminal defense attorney with a massive reputation inside of Indiana. And basically, we thought it would be super interesting to kind of check out some of the other cases he's doing, because we're very interested in learning more about the different principles in this case and their legal styles. And there's no better way of learning more about that than actually seeing them perform in court.
And in this particular instance, it's actually the beginning of a murder trial in Brown County, Indiana. And so we decided to go and observe, basically. And before we get into our observations, I'm going to try to give the gist of the case by reading a few highlights from the PCA. But before I do that, let me tell you that this case is the trial of a man named Randy Small over the murder of another man named Robert Adair. Clyde Small said Randy had told him that he had shot his neighbor, Robert Adair, at approximately 2 p.m. on September 15, 2021, over a property dispute regarding the location of a mailbox. With that information, officers went to the Adair residence. Deputy Briles headed towards the driveway and found a red pickup truck in the grass alongside the road. Deputy Briles found a deceased man in the driver's seat of the truck with his head literally blown off. It was believed this male was Adair based upon what little was left of the male's chin matching Adair's BMV photograph. Additionally, the red pickup truck was registered to Robert James Adair. It should be further noted that next to the red F-150, a mailbox and post was lying on the ground. When I spoke with Clyde Small, Ernie Small was also in Clyde's vehicle, so I ended up speaking with both individuals. I asked if Randy specifically said what had happened. Ernie stated that Randy claimed he pulled up beside Robert Adair. Robert Adair allegedly opened his truck door and his dog came out. Randy informed Ernie that he believed Robert had a gun and was going to shoot him, so he shot Mr. Adair. With that said, I think we should start talking about this trial and what we witnessed in the opening days.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is Andy Baldwin for the defense, Randy Small, and the murder of Bob Adair. Let's start by talking about day one.
Yes. So at the beginning of any criminal trial, or civil trial for that matter, there's going to be a process for selecting a jury. So 12 peers of the accused who are going to sit on a jury, along with some alternates who are going to basically come back with a verdict.
Exactly. And before that process begins, sometimes you have what happened in this case. You have a situation where the attorneys are permitted to give what's called a mini opening, which is a short speech where the prosecutor and the defense attorney, in this case, the prosecutor was Ted Adams, who formerly worked with Andy Baldwin.
And who is now the prosecutor of Brown County in Indiana.
And Andy Baldwin, the defense attorney. These two men each got a chance to make a short speech, basically giving their interpretation of what the trial would show.
Yes. It was particularly fascinating, I think, for you and I. In our profile episodes on Andy Baldwin, we actually interviewed not only Ted Adams, but also Rob Seat, who is his co-counsel in this and is the deputy prosecutor on this. So it's these are people who have been colleagues, who have interacted with one another a lot, so they're familiar with each other's styles and go-to moves. So you're not seeing people kind of come up against each other for the first time. You're seeing there's a lot of experience in this room.
Why don't you remind us of how Ted Adams rather memorably described what it was like for him to go up against his mentor, Andy Baldwin?
He likened it to Obi-Wan v. Anakin. So a Star Wars reference. And frankly, having seen what I've seen so far, an apt one, because you have a lot of skills being displayed here on opposite sides. And it certainly was very interesting to watch for us, I think. And I'm sure for the jurors.
Prosecution gets to speak first. Can you tell us about Prosecutor Ted Adams' mini opening statement?
I was really floored by it. It was incredibly vivid and evocative. Basically, what he did was he took the prospective jurors through the image of the aftermath of Small's shooting of Adair, which is not being contested. Nobody is saying that somebody other than Randy Smalls shot Adair. We'll get into what the defense is saying in a moment, but it's basically taking us through the really horrific aftermath of what a gun, what a shot like that does to a body, and ending with the incredibly memorable image of Adair's hands folded on his lap. So I thought that was incredibly effective.
I think his first line was, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let me tell you about a moment frozen in time. And that moment is Robert Adair sitting peacefully in his truck. He's got the equipment with him to fix a mailbox. His hands are folded on his lap, and his head has been exploded brutally.
It's one of those things. He's talking about Bob Adair's tools. He's talking about his cane being in the car, establishing that he walks with a cane. He needs help with a cane to walk, establishing that he is a craftsman. He's an artisan whose pieces actually, were displayed in Nashville, Indiana, of course, which is the seat of Brown County. So like an expert author of a fiction or nonfiction work, picking the details that they need to convey character to you, he's picking those details that paint a scene that's really disturbing and memorable for these prospective jurors. So I thought his opening was really strong.
And he ended it on just a little bit of a cliffhanger, because he says, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a body cam video is worth 1,000,000 words.
Yeah.
And we've got this body cam video of what happened when the police went to arrest Randy Small. So that obviously would make us all wonder what's on this body cam video.
Yeah, I thought Ted Adams' opening was incredible. I just want to say that before because obviously we're profiling Andy because he is relevant to the Delphi case, but it's always interesting to see some of the other attorneys in this and sort of kind of the back and forth. So I did want to single that out because it was chilling.
Now let's talk a little bit about Andy's mini opening. Before we do, again, the circumstances are his client has admitted to shooting a man who was in his pickup truck with his hands folded. I thought it was really interesting because at the beginning of the mini opening, Andy goes and he stands by Small. I think there's a tendency for people to see criminal defendants, rightfully or wrongfully, as the other. And so I think Baldwin was trying to emphasize that this is a human being. And we're returning to that theme later. And he says this was a case of self-defense. And the police failed to investigate that angle. The police included in the report a provably false fact, which totally derailed the investigation. And he wanted to emphasize at the time of the shooting, Adair was on Small's property in a truck, and that he'd previously tried to run Small over in this truck. And again, he says the police did not investigate self-defense. And he says Bob Adair had been drinking. He had some drugs in his system. He wasn't wanted on this land. And at the moment before the shooting, he seemed to be reaching for something or driving at Small. And so Small felt threatened. And Small felt it was a situation, it was either him or Bob Adair. And Small chose self-defense.
And that was also basically kind of telling the jury, okay, here's the story we're going with. And almost as we talk, as the analogy we often use is, writing the checks to cash later.
Right.
We're going to tell you about how law enforcement messed this up. We're going to tell you about how it was self-defense, but why the evidence doesn't show that, because it wasn't properly investigated. Right. And we're going to talk about maybe some of the problems with the victim in this case.
Yes. And they return to that theme a little bit later on day one.
Yes. So being, it's an aggressive opening. It's very much a kind of setting things up opening.
So the process of selecting jurors then begins in earnest. And what happens then, there were 60 jurors in this room, or 60 prospective jurors. And in fact, there were 60 prospective jurors and there were 60 seats.
Yeah, we should say about we're so I think our listeners may enjoy some of this because you know how awkward we are. We showed up super early for this thing because that's what we do normally. I guess that's what we do. It's Brown County is like hazy with smoke from Canada. And we walk in and then sit down on a bench after going through security and then get kicked out again because we're way too early. And the bailiff was like, I can't babysit you, basically. And we're like, we respect that. We're just going to go outside. No worries, sir. And he basically told us, you can't sit here. Like, you can't, like, there are 60 seats for 60 prospective jurors. And I asked, can we just stand awkwardly in the corner? And he was like, fine. So that's what we did for a lot of this until they started kicking jurors out. And by kicking, I'm out. They weren't mean to them. Just people get eliminated. And so as more and more people were eliminated, Kevin and I slunk into some seats. So that's how things roll around here. And that's kind of, and you might be surprised. Why is this open to the public? I mean, it's public. It's open to anybody. The press or whoever can go to these things. And we were not allowed to record, so we did not. And we're not allowed to talk to any of the jurors, so we did not, because that messes up the process. But we were able to see it, and I'm glad we were, because it really gives
there's a great
insight.
There's a great reason why we're not allowed to talk to the jurors. And actually, we're allowed to say hello to the jurors. We're not supposed to talk to the jurors about the case, because if you're talking to the jurors about the case, you're giving them information that maybe they shouldn't have.
Yes. So, you can't just, if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can't just go to a hearing, or you can't just go to jury selection and then hang out in the hallway and ask people, hey, what do you think about the case? Because they will tell, that they're supposed to tell the bailiff if that happens.
And actually, you and I showed up this morning knowing this was day one of the murder trial of Randy Small. These jurors had no idea what they were being.
A lot of them were actually expressed feeling very upset about it, because a lot of them had been unaware that this case had happened. It got some local press, but it's not like a huge national story. So I could totally understand some people missing it. And they were like, honestly, it makes me upset that something like this could even happen here. Not weighing in on whether he's guilty or not, but just the fact that such violence could take place here for whatever reason is upsetting. So that actually came up. So, that's just to give you a sense of how these things work. And also, one thing before what is voir dire?
It's basically the process of jury selection where each party's attorney, there's the state and the defense, has the opportunity to address the prospective jurors and ask questions and such. So you put 12 prospective jurors in the jury box, and attorneys ask questions and also basically introduce themselves and their personalities to the jurors. And typically, the questions they ask are little hints about what sort of defenses or arguments they're going to make, because basically they want to see how it's going to play. And also they want to see, if I'm going to make a keystone of my case is going to be dogs are bad. I want to make sure that nobody's on this case who's a big dog lover.
Or
that's a crazy example, but yeah.
So like if I was a prosecutor putting my beloved dog Lanny on trial for eating, bacon out of somebody's kitchen, and I was, talking to a jury, and one of the prospective jurors was a dog who had done something similar, I'd be trying to get at, like, do you think it's okay for a dog to come into somebody's kitchen and just root through the cabinets to get the bacon? And if that dog's like, yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I think that's my right. I'm going to be like, gotcha, and then get out of here. And I don't know why I'm talking to a dog in this whole situation, but we've talked a lot about how great HelloFresh is when it comes to meals. They really want you to have it all, free time and delicious food. That's why they take care of all the meal planning and even ship the ingredients right to your door, so you've got everything you need to make a wonderful meal for yourself and your family. But let's chat a moment about a side of HelloFresh we didn't know about ourselves until very recently.
I'll be honest, I don't just eat at meal times. During the day or when I'm relaxing in the evening, I like to munch on snacks or sides. And I assumed that was something HelloFresh could not help me with. So I would still have to trudge out to the grocery store and stand in line to get those sorts of treats. But I was wrong.
Let me tell you about HelloFresh Market. It lets you shop online and take your pick from a curated selection of over 100 items, including all sorts of tasty treats and desserts. And it will all be added to your weekly HelloFresh delivery. It's the best of meal kits and online grocery shopping combined in one weekly box.
This is another great reason to try out HelloFresh. And remember, Murder Sheet listeners get a special discount.
Go to hellofresh.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to hellofresh.com/msheet50 and use code msheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Try out America's #1 meal kit today. We are so delighted to work with our sponsor, Brilliant Earth. This is a company that offers some of the most brilliant and romantic engagement rings and wedding bands out there, all the while ensuring a commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability.
If you're looking to get married or to become engaged, or even if you're just searching for a special piece of fine jewelry, you have to check out their website. They make browsing so easy.
They even let you design your own perfect engagement ring, or you can shop by style. I love the delicate willow rings, along with the 3-stone Nadia rings and the classic freesia rings. It's so hard to choose.
And you don't have to worry about the ethical implications of your purchase. Your special gift, your engagement ring, your wedding band should never be tarnished by the idea that the gems or materials came from an abusive system.
See, Brilliant Earth has a commitment to beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means one thing. They only accept diamonds from mining operations in countries that strictly follow international labor, trade, and environmental standards. Fewer than 1% of other diamond suppliers meet Brilliant Earth standards.
You can feel good about your purchase, knowing that you're supporting a brand that actually cares about its ethical impact and is committed to fostering better standards in the jewelry business.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com. There we go.
And attorneys often like to begin with a little joke. Ted Adams began by saying, this is going to be a 10-day trial. Most of us only own 3 or 4 suits, so you'll probably see us cycle through the same suits a few times.
Yeah, I thought the attorneys really did a good job. I thought the attorneys really did a good job of, you're trying to be personable. It's a serious topic. Everyone's taking it seriously, but you don't have to always take yourself so seriously.
Why don't I read some of the questions Ted Adams asked, and then maybe you can give your overall impressions of Ted Adams in this process.
Yeah, totally.
So he asked the prospective jurors things like, what did you think when you heard this was a murder trial? What kind of evidence do you expect to see? How do you think a victim of a murder tells their story? What does the concept of self-defense mean to you? Do you think we should have the right to use any amount of force in self-defense? When we look at a person using self-defense, do we look at what's in his mind or what's in the community's mind? And then he gave a hypothetical situation. He said this is something that actually happened in Brown County at one point.
Oh, yeah, this is awful.
He said a person believed that the Chinese were invading, so he gets a hatchet. He sees a Chinese lady. He hits her with the hatchet, and he claims it's self-defense because the Chinese were invading. So his question was, should we actually accept that as self-defense?
I thought that he did a really good job of essentially explaining things in a plain-spoken way that was easy to understand because, you know, you're an attorney, Kevin, but I'm just a journalist here. It could be a bit kind of confusing or, you know, maybe what your own opinion is might be different from the law. But I think it's a situation where he was actually describing things very well to people so they could follow along without seeming condescending and without seeming like, you know, basically what they're doing is trying to figure out who's going to be a terrible fit for the jury. But you don't want to make people feel like they're on some sort of horrible game show. You don't want to make people feel rejected. So doing it in a way that's respectful and not picking on people, but still manages to tease out their answers in a way that can give you information, I think is a skill. And I thought that's when he shone at, and I was, you know, I thought it was a good balance of, he was very personable, down to earth, kind of coming across like a regular guy, but you know that even his questions that you're not quite like sure of where's that going, you know, it's leading to somewhere where it's going to give him data to make jury selections.
So that was his first round. The first round for the defense was handled by Andy Baldwin's co-counsel, Kelly Pyle. Tell me about how she did.
Now, I'd say, and I was impressed by the kind of tightrope act that Miss Pyle walked on this, because her role as a defense attorney is almost to kind of challenge some of these jurors, because if they get someone on the jury where they're just like, well, anybody who gets arrested is bad, they're going to have a huge problem. So I felt she kind of was almost getting vulnerable with the jury of like, you know, are we going to have a problem with this? Like, if I go after the detective in this case, are you going to reflexively say, I'm going to be defensive of law enforcement? You know, I mean, basically it's like kind of nicely asking people, do you have a problem with this?
At one point she says, do you agree with the phrase, you don't speak ill of the dead? And then a moment later she says, well, we are going to speak ill of the decedent. Do you have a problem with that? So basically she's saying we're going to speak critically about the man whose head was blown off.
And I think like if she came at it from a really aggressive standpoint, that could be off-putting to people. But I thought she did a good job of kind of coming at it from like a friendly, relaxed perspective while also being firm. It's like kind of displaying the vulnerability to kind of establish rapport, and then also kind of being like, but we need to have boundaries here. Like, you need to be able to do this and that and this, and you need to be prepared for that. So she brought a very different energy from Ted Adams, but it was one that made sense because it serves her client's case as they're trying to basically find jurors who are going to be open-minded enough to maybe consider that there could be a good reason for somebody blowing somebody's head off with a shotgun, which we can acknowledge that's a hard place for a lot of people to get to, understandably. It's such a violent act. But what they're trying to find is jurors who will at least entertain that, give it a chance.
So once the prosecution and the defense each had a round, a few jurors were removed from the panel, and then they were replaced, and then the prosecution had another round of questions. This time, the questions were asked by Rob Seat, who's the co-counsel on the case.
Yes, who, of course, we also interviewed for Andy's profile episode. So we were like, hey, everybody in Brown County. And he, I thought, brought a similar energy to Ted Adams, where it's kind of establishing rapport and you know, walking people through complicated concepts of topics. I mean, do you remember some of the topics that he specifically spoke to?
One that I thought led to a memorable moment. He says, when we talk about reasonable doubt, about having to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt, we're not saying you have to be 100% convinced of something absolutely. We basically mean you have to be firmly convinced of something. And so he asked the prospective jurors, can you think of times in your life when you were firmly convinced, but not necessarily absolutely 100% convinced? And a few people had problems answering that question. Perhaps you in the audience can speculate what your answer would have been. But then one person piped up and said, well, I know a time when I was firmly convinced, but not 100% convinced. It's when I got married.
Everybody loved that.
They got a big laugh.
That was a big laugh. Yeah. And it deserved it because it was quite funny.
He also asked about what he called the great cookie caper.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like, okay. So like the analogies. So I love analogies. So I was.
So he says there's two kids. One of them got into a cookie jar. So then you go into one bedroom and you see a kid who is asleep. In the other bedroom, you see a child who's awake, pretending to be asleep. And you see chocolate on his mouth and cookie crumbs in the room. Are you firmly convinced that one of these kids did it? And so people were answering that. And one person at this point, who turned out to be a retired law enforcement officer, said, well, I think that one person who had the chocolate on his mouth was definitely involved. But, what if there were some pets in the area who also actually did it? And maybe the other kid just ate it some too, but was cleaner about it.
And they were like, that's what decades in law enforcement does to you. You're a little bit suspicious of everybody. But I thought that was great. He kind of gave us some interesting cultural insight into Brown County, I feel, which for folks who are not from Indiana is a very, very beautiful, somewhat rural and rugged area of Indiana that's very heavily forested. And the county seat is Nashville, which is a very confusing name, but it's this very cute town. It's kind of touristy, but it's also kind of like art colony-esque. But anyways, like what one thing Rob Seat said was that one thing he liked about working in Brown County was that we have blunt people here. And he noted that he himself is married to a person who's blunt. And basically what he was saying is he's trying to encourage the jurors, don't just say things that you think me or the other attorneys want to hear. If you think a certain way, be honest about it. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There's no wrong answers. We just need to be able to pick a jury that is fair. And if you have like a strongly held opinion on something, let it out, because you're not doing anyone any favors by like hiding that. So I thought that was interesting what he said about Brown County, but also kind of highlights a point like it's not the time to be kind of coy. And actually, a couple of times people would answer something and you're kind of like, okay, that might get them asked to leave the jury. But the lawyers were really appreciative of it because they were like, that's honest. And that would have been a problem potentially. But like, thank you for stating that.
And then it was time for the next round with the defense. And this was Andy Baldwin's time. Should I tell about some of the details he said, and then you give big picture impressions, or do you want to start with big picture impressions?
Why don't you do the details first, and then we can get bigger.
So Baldwin stands up, and he starts by making a joke about his shirt being untucked, and sometimes he tries to fix that. And then again, he walks over to the defendant, Randy Small, and he says, I want you to take a good look at Randy Small. He's a human being, and he is presumed innocent. But then he waits a beat and he says, but he probably did something wrong. He wouldn't be sitting here. What do you think of that statement? And he directs the question to a prospective juror. So it was like a surprisingly little intense moment.
Yeah, it was. Starting out intense, which is the one word I would use to describe his style throughout this.
It was an incredible performance.
I think as we left, like to take a break, I was like, you said incredible. And I was like, that was like an artist. He was like connecting with people really well, but also like asking these hard questions and getting really deep. And like he was kind of jumping from thing to thing quickly, but it felt like it all flowed.
And he was having he was his eyes were from where we were sitting. We were behind the jury,
Yeah.
and you could see his eyes focusing intently on these jurors, and he would ask them pretty intense, surprising questions, and then he'd like make a joke or tell a funny story about himself. One person said, I believe in innocent until proven guilty, and Baldwin stares at them and says, "Do you really believe that? I need to get to your heart. Do you really believe he's innocent until proven guilty? I can take away that last part. Do you believe he's innocent?"
Yeah. As he sits here now, which of course, under our system of law, he is. He's just, he's not been convicted yet. He is an innocent man, technically, under the Constitution. But believing that is a whole other thing. And I thought it was fascinating to watch him interact with these folks, because he really is just kind of going between these different roles, trying to get them, I think, ultimately to like let their guards down and be honest about like, can you handle being on a jury and potentially being open to acquitting somebody even in a hard case, right?
Right.
And I was like, damn, like, I mean, it was very effective. I was like, you could tell like he's building the rapport. One moment that fascinated me, and obviously we're not going to name any jurors or prospective jurors. I mean, as you noticed, we're not named anybody because that's just irrelevant, frankly. But in any coverage of any trial, you can rest assured we're not going to name jurors.
Totally inappropriate.
That would be completely inappropriate. That's not how the media should roll.
The only exception would be if after the trial is over, a juror agrees to be interviewed.
Yeah, if a juror said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about this, and I want my name out there," then fine. But there was the person that Kevin mentioned as the law enforcement officer. He and Andy kept going back and forth, not in the way you might think. Basically, this law enforcement officer, to every question, was answering incredibly reasonable, well-articulated, and well-reasoned answers. Basically, like to questions like, do you think law enforcement is always right, or do you think cops can make mistakes? And basically going into, yeah, and I've seen it, and here's how it's a problem, and here's how it can happen, and like just kind of like everything you'd be like, yeah. And Andy kept saying to him basically like stop making me like you. I don't want a cop on the jury. And they're just going back and forth. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, because like, it was just like, you could totally see like, yeah, he doesn't want anyone who has law enforcement experience on the jury. But this guy was so well-spoken and reasonable and seemed so open-minded. So you're also like, man, it was, I mean, didn't you feel like that was like a real
Baldwin says, I'm worried about you. Should I be? He said, what kind of fool would leave a former cop on a murder trial?
But it's like this rapport developed between them that was really cool. And I was like, and also as other people are seeing that, they're seeing that rapport develop, and they're digging that. So it builds up rapport with the whole group.
It basically, yeah, Baldwin is saying, I'm not sure if I should trust you enough to leave you on here, but you're making me like you. And I think he's showing the guy respect. He's
not going around to people and being like, you suck because you're a cop, or I don't want you because you don't seem open-minded. He's engaging with them. At one point in the later round, he basically said something like, one person said, I'm not sure if I would be okay with seeing an accused murderer smirk and laugh at a trial. I think that would influence my decision. And he was just like, yeah, thank you for saying that, because like that's important for us to know. So like he's being very respectful. There is like a tension there, but it's not like lashing out at people or anything. It's like trying to dig at the truth, at the truth of how you will be on this jury.
Yeah, they actually talked about the gory pictures a lot, letting people know what to expect.
And basically what they're trying to determine is they're trying to explain twofold. One is that they're not just putting these pictures in there to shock and awe people. They're demonstrating elements of the crime that need photographic evidence to be brought forth. And basically, how are you going to react? Like, if this is going to be something that's too upsetting, too distracting, too much, then you are not the person for this jury, basically. And basically giving people the opportunity to speak through what they might be experiencing.
He made a point of talking again about the idea of being critical of the police. The main police officer who's going to be a witness in the case was sitting over the prosecution table, and Baldwin said, I'd like that guy. I like that detective, but I'll be going after him. Is that going to bother you? And he said, I'm not the type, I don't want to get nitpicky with police officers. They should be given respect.
He even criticized the defund the police movement, which was wild. Yeah, he was kind of like, I think, maybe recognizing that, I don't know, maybe his perception of Brown County is that it has support for law enforcement in the community, and trying to kind of talk through, like, I'm not just anti-cop, so will you follow along with my logic and my reasoning as I'm trying to, basically, some could say attack, others would say question the credibility of the detective in this case. And, gauging people, also asking things like, do you have a law enforcement background? Do you have any law enforcement in your family? So, like, kind of walking through that.
He also talked about, we often see stories about people who are freed after being wrongly convicted.
Yeah.
And he said, in those cases, we will often see interviews with the wrongly convicted person or with the attorneys involved. He said, but we never seem to see interviews with the jury members who got it wrong in the first place. And he said, I believe the jury got it wrong because they did not value the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt enough. And he asked people, am I wrong to blame the jury in those cases?
Seemed very loaded. It was he did it very deftly. Although, like, I will say, like, it's kind of interesting, kind of the relying on emotions. Like, you're going to feel so much guilt if this guy gets acquitted, or this guy gets, released later on because it was a wrongful conviction. But of course, a lot of those cases, if it was a situation like that, somebody was arrested in the 80s for a rape murder and then DNA exonerated them later, that's very different from somebody shooting somebody with a shotgun, admitting to it. It's just kind of interesting that wrongful convictions get thrown out in a context where, nobody's really saying that somebody else actually did this.
And then also he was very direct, but I think we're making it sound more confrontational.
Yeah, it really wasn't. It was very, I say deftly handled. It was deftly handled in that it was kind of just like knowing when to back off, knowing when to go for it. And I think that's complicated when you're talking to people in a possibly charged or tense situation, or asking them personal questions, or asking them questions that might offend them politically, socially, otherwise. And I think he kind of walking that line is important, obviously, in this situation. I feel like he did that.
And he suggested, it's possible that Randy Small is not going to testify. And he said, well, why wouldn't he testify? Because if I'm accused of something, I'm going to want to get up and tell my story. Yeah. Like, what do you guys think of that?
Yeah. Kind of giving them an opportunity to, chew on aspects of the case that may come up and let him see their reactions.
And he found good ways to tell people that, sometimes people have perceptions that may not be correct. You have to be willing to adjust those. And he did that by telling a story on himself. He said, I have no idea if this story is true or not, but it's a good story. It illustrates a point. He said, I was driving down the road. I'm a defense attorney. I see a police car with sirens pulling someone over, and my first thought is, what did that guy do? And I'm a defense attorney, and I shouldn't think that way.
Exactly.
He also said...
And that's like a way for him to, like, let people know that, like, you should admit to your judgments. It's a judgment-free zone. Like, we're not going to judge you for having that snap reaction. Maybe I don't want you on the jury, though.
And he said, we also have to understand that sometimes people have reactions of a certain nature, whether they're innocent or guilty. And he actually told this story about how when he was a teenager, his parents discovered in the house he lived in a hidden supply of old Playboy magazines. And it looked like somebody had gone through them. And his parents said to him, Andy, did you go through these Playboys? And he said no. But as he said it, he was smirking because he felt uncomfortable and they believed he was lying. He said, I was wrongfully accused. I did not look at those Playboys, I promise.
So it's like people can have different reactions. And also, one thing that I was impressed some of the jurors were talking about was kind of like understanding that people can have different stress responses. People can have responses that are off-putting to you, but they don't necessarily mean the person's guilty. I'm always troubled why when you see like on, especially visual mediums, like people being like, oh, this guy didn't like look like I think he should, so he must be guilty. And it's like that totally throws out lots of things. Shock, neuroatypical people who might be having a different response, different trauma responses. It's not a very good way of gauging things. Now, listen, I'm not telling anybody to not listen to your gut. If somebody's acting, in a way that's off-putting, interrogating that is fine. But I think what basically he's saying is that maybe jumping to conclusions is not what we want on a jury, which I think is fair. Now, that being said, sometimes, I was thinking of this when he was talking about this. There have been cases where defendants have basically yelled at victims in court or been badly behaved. I have to imagine that, maybe that's a situation where anybody won't want to see that. But he was really talking more about smirking, smiling, not looking upset.
And it seems almost ridiculous to say it, but his performance during this voir dire was really a tour de force. It was an incredible performance. I believe you were especially impressed with his ending. You want to discuss that?
Absolutely. So it was actually really incredible. So he talked about how the order of, essentially things. The prosecution presents their case first, then him. Prosecution has the last say in the case. And what he was saying was just he doesn't want a jury or a juror who basically hears the prosecution side of it, makes up their mind guilty, and that's it. And he phrased it very, simply as just wait for me. Please wait. And
before making up your mind,
please wait. Don't just do it immediately. And I thought that was very effective. It was almost poignant, in terms of how he was expressing that.
Literally, his last two words were, please wait.
Yeah.
And then he turns and goes and sits down.
It was that was good. That was really well done. I think one thing in this case is, and one thing that in any case, really, the skill of an attorney does not necessarily translate into it being an easy case to win. Right?
Yes.
There can be very difficult cases. There can be easy cases that can be botched. But the skill of an attorney is seen in how they are, what they're doing with the case they have. And I think in the jury selection in the voir dire that we saw today, you could see that there's a tremendous amount of skills on both sides of the aisle, on the prosecution side and on the defense side. And you are seeing people who are skilled at their craft doing what they do and working each side. And it's heartening to see that because the system works best when it has that. The system doesn't benefit from weak defense attorneys. People are often, saying, well, okay, well, if the guy's guilty, shouldn't you basically just kind of, I don't know, blow it? No, that's not it's not a perfect system, but I do believe, and I think Andy said this at one point, that it is the best in the world. And the only reason it gets to be anywhere near that is if people are really doing their jobs and taking them seriously and working tirelessly to exonerate their client or to convict somebody they think that they think is guilty in the case of the prosecutor. And it takes having smart, savvy attorneys on both sides to make it work. And criminal defense work and criminal prosecution, that's very important to our communities. Crime, especially violent crime, it's important to get those cases right. And it's just really kind of a privilege that we get to go see some of this and watch it and sort of see it play out in these communities in Indiana.
I think some people who'd heard some of our profile episodes on him and heard some of the praise people gave to Andy Baldwin wondered if he was being oversold. And based on what we saw during voir dire, he was not. It was an incredible performance. We haven't even seen his opening argument. We will go back in a couple of days to hear his opening argument, also to hear the opening argument delivered by Ted Adams, and we will report back on that. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen, but HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code msheet16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again,